Welcome and thank you for joining us for our free National Thursday webinar. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata and I'm also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate, and I'm your host. We're here to explore the important topic of risk. It affects every strata scheme, large or small, residential or mixed use. Strata living is a unique form of ownership and community, and when it works well, it delivers enormous benefits. However, challenges are mounting, ranging from unresolved building defects to increased compliance demands, governance struggles, and conflicts of interest. Now, these issues not only threaten the financial health of our schemes, but also impact the communities we live in, the safety of our buildings, and residents' confidence. We're honoured to be joined by Dr. Nicole Johnston from Strata Knowledge, an internationally respected researcher and consultant who has spent more than a decade investigating the complex dynamics of strata governance and reform across Australia. Dr. Nicole will be speaking today about key risk areas, not just the symptoms, but the systems behind them, and exploring ways that research, governance, and better practices can lead to more resilient outcomes. Nicole will also provide a preview of insights from the upcoming Strata Impact Conference on the Gold Coast in August, where further discussion and debates on these issues will take place. As always, a reminder that the content of today's session is general in nature and does not constitute advice. If you're dealing with specific matters in your scheme, we do encourage you to seek independent professional advice before taking any action. And additionally, in the spirit of transparency, as I mentioned in the introduction, in addition to running LookUpStrata, I also operate Tower Body Corporate, which provides strata management services in southeast Queensland. We're looking forward to a practical, evidence-based and forward-looking discussion, and we thank you all for joining us. And with that, I'd like to officially welcome Dr. Nicole Johnston, the founder and director of Strata Knowledge, an independent research and consulting firm specialising in strata and community title law and governance. As a socio-legal researcher, Nicole is focused on translating applied research into practice by collaborating with industry to ensure impactful and beneficial outcomes. Nicole started her professional life as a commercial lawyer, but for the past 15 years, she's worked as an academic. Nicole has led numerous research projects on topics including building defects, strata insurance, strata law reform, fire safety, conflicts of interest, and developer governance responsibilities. She consults with governments and has chaired numerous international forums, and Nicole is a regular presenter at industry conferences. And we were very lucky to have her MC LookUpStrata's inaugural in-person event on the Gold Coast earlier this year. Nicole holds degrees in psychology, criminology, law, and has a PhD in strata and community title law and governance. Welcome, Dr. Nicole. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much, Nikki. I'm really happy to be here with everyone today. I know we've got people from around the country, from different areas of interest, so hopefully you'll get something out of this presentation. So I'm talking about navigating critical risks in strata. And yes, there are lots of risks that we could discuss. I could have had quite a list that I could have shared with you today. But I really just am going to focus on three critical areas. They're diverse areas, but it's really about me shedding some light on some of these risk factors from a researcher's perspective. So that's where I'm coming from, very much a researcher's perspective. So it's areas that I have done research on very recently, and so hopefully you'll gain some insight through the presentation. Now, of course, I don't have all the answers to some of the problems that arise in strata. There's often not a lot of silver bullets in strata, as many of you know, but awareness is really important, and hopefully deeper discussion will lead to some beneficial outcomes for owners. So that's really my purpose here today. I want to flag some of the insights that I've gained through my research, and hopefully we continue to have a conversation about how these sorts of risks impact our strata communities so that we can then make hopefully beneficial change in the long run. So hopefully, as I said, that you can walk away with some new insights, some new knowledge, but we keep the conversation going. That's really important. So the first risk that I wanted to talk about is building care inaction. So this is really about maintenance and repair obligations, and our failure to deal with these repair and maintenance requirements in aging buildings in particular. And so what is really clear is that financial constraints a lack of skill and knowledge, and low awareness of maintenance obligations have contributed to building care inaction. And this is not just in Australia, this is in many other countries. So we see problems that we see arising in Australia also arising in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in America, in Canada, in New Zealand. It's not unique to Australia. So we have the same sorts of issues and grounded in the same sorts of starting base, I suppose, as we do in Australia around these sort of financial constraints, etc. So building dilapidation, it's widespread. And again, we see commonality in the types of problems. So concrete spalling, water leaking, fire safety issues, structural and non-structural cracking. These are very common failures in buildings as they age. And as I said, we see them observed in Australia as we do in other jurisdictions. But to compound this problem, we also have some legacy issues with building defects. So as many people know, we've had a crisis in this country for many decades where we've had really huge problems around construction-related building defects. And of course, if they don't get dealt with in a timely manner in the beginning of these schemes' lives, then we have to deal with them throughout the course of their lives. And so we have some legacy issues that we also have to deal with, as well as just the general maintenance and repair obligations that go with being in these sorts of buildings. We're talking about complex infrastructure that does need to be cared for. And of course, what really brought this to the fore was the devastating effects that happened in 2021 when Champlain Tower South in Florida partially collapsed and killed a large number of people. And off the back of that, there were a lot of questions whether similar sorts of things could happen in Australia. And so this is why we really need to turn our minds and our attentions to dealing with repairs and maintenance as building age. It's a critical issue and it's a high risk issue because we're talking about the safety of people's lives. So the research that I did, I looked at a large sample of buildings across mainly the eastern coast of Australia, and I looked at historical documentation. So I did a bit of a deep dive into building meeting minutes, lots of reports that had been in the record keeping of these buildings, a whole range of different information that I collected, and I sort of spent a lot of time. It's quite a laborious task, as you can imagine, because we're going back sort of 6 and 10 years worth of work to see how decisions are made in an owner's corporation or a body corporate, when they're made, what are the sort of the barriers, I suppose, or the factors that contribute to building care inaction in these particular schemes. And there was certainly some commonality in terms of those contributing factors. And so I've sort of classified them, I suppose, into these 8 or so different areas. And so what's really evident was that in schemes that had low participation and disengagement, so low participation on committees, for example, low participation at the AGM or EGMs, people were just generally disengaged in their community. There was a very clear relationship there between the lack of attention towards repair and maintenance in those buildings. So we want to see more participation. We want to see more engagement in these schemes so it can lead to better outcomes. The biggest thing for me, and the area that I think really we need to concentrate on is around maintenance reactivity. We are really poor planners when it comes to dealing with maintenance and repairs in strata schemes. So what I often see, and what was very clear looking through the documentation that I analysed, was that committees and owners corporations react when something happens in their building. So they're not proactive at all. We're not looking at taking care of our building through its whole life cycle, on an annual basis. We're not up on the roof checking what's going on. Everything's not on the forefront, I suppose, of looking at these sorts of issues. We're very reactive. So we wait for the leaks to happen. We wait for perhaps a fire safety audit to be done and they find something that's problematic or there's a failure. We just aren't good at planning these sorts of things, and it is really contributing to long-term problems. You then get scope creep in terms of the types of works, the remedial works that then ultimately are required to be undertaken, and then the costs are also much higher. So we need to change that mindset. We need to be putting repair and maintenance at the forefront of every single meeting that we have on an annual basis. We need to be looking at making sure that these buildings are well maintained before it becomes a massive issue where remedial works is required. Another thing that was very evident was there was a lot of works deferment. So oftentimes these issues will be raised. There might be a leak, for example, in a building, and then you look and you'll see, well, when did those works actually get undertaken? And sometimes people have left them for 5, 6, 10 years. I've saw in some instances there were 10 years from when the issue was first raised to when it was actually rectified. And of course, then the works become much more difficult and much more costly to deal with. So there's a lot of works deferment. People aren't, again, on the forefront of, or the front foot of dealing with these particular works when they arise. Another big issue is around financial strategies, a lot of poor financial strategies. So we're not good at understanding what needs to be happen in these buildings in terms of repairs and maintenance, and then trying to work out how we fund these repair and maintenance requirements. Two things really became very apparent to me when I was looking through the documentation was there is a lot of what I call levy manipulation. And I'm sure there's a lot of people nodding their head. They probably see this quite regularly, both in their own schemes and when they manage these schemes. So what people tend to do is they're trying to keep the yearly levy at the same rate year on, year out. And so what you start to see is if it's a year where your administration costs are higher, then those costs will be met with the higher levy in the administrative fund, but then they'll push down the sinking or the capital works fund so that there's still that evenness in terms of the type of the amount that is being paid at each year. So I saw that quite regularly happened. And then when you have a year where you're okay with your administrative fund, you'll sort of try and push back up onto your sinking fund to make sure that works. So that's a real problem. We have to be much more careful and more considered in our financial planning strategies. Another thing that was really interesting was, again, what I call funds hogging. I'm sure that someone might have a better terminology that they can use in relation to this, but what I saw was when people start to get their money together in their sinking fund or their capital works fund, they're trying to keep it there. It's like this, precious little pot of gold that they don't want to use for expenditure in these areas. So they're doing really well. Oftentimes, the amount of money that they will have that's in that account will be higher than what's forecasted, probably because they're actually not spending it for what they were meant to spend it on, which was around their repairs and maintenance. And so again, you get that works deferment. A good example is around painting, and they'll go, oh, we don't really need to paint this year. We'll maybe leave it for a couple of years and get more and more funding in. Meanwhile, the surface of the building is deteriorating. It needs to be painted, but they're holding off getting that done because they might be looking at, well, we could have some, we could improve the foyer, or we could improve the pool area and those sorts of things. So that is another thing that I was seeing quite regularly, this funds hogging, especially of the sinking fund or the capital works fund. Another thing that came up quite regularly, and this was really a source of disputes, was a lot of confusion around boundaries and who's responsible in terms of the works. So whether it's a lot owner's problem or whether it's going to be the body corporate that needs to deal with it. So there's a lot of confusion around where those boundary lines should be drawn. And it's very difficult because each state in Australia has different ways and they're regulated differently where those boundaries might be. So there is a lot of confusion around this. So it's really important that people are very, very clear about what areas that they need to take care of as a lot owner and what areas are common property and where the body corporate may need to take care of. And so I think we need to understand that better. So there was a lot of confusion. There were a lot of disputes around that. And again, it leads to works deferment because there's arguments about who's responsible to deal with the repairs and maintenance of a particular thing. Another thing that was really evident was there was a lot of poor professional guidance, and there was certainly underutilisation of real knowledgeable professionals. What was quite alarming is that I saw, where remedial works might have been in the tens to hundreds to millions dollars worth of works, and no one was engaging with a lawyer to have a look at the agreements. No one was engaging in financial advisors to think about the best financial strategy to fund these remedial works. It just was just not evident. Another thing that was quite concerning is the lack of using project managers to assist in this whole process. That was certainly lacking. We saw certainly at the bigger end where you've got really complex, very costly repair works, there will be an engagement of a project manager. But oftentimes for things that are 10, 20, $30,000 works, sometimes you'll see the caretaker step in and deal with those sorts of works, which is just, horrifying to me, really. They haven't got often the skills to deal with those sorts of things. So people have to be very mindful of the role that people play in dealing with these sorts of works. Also, what was very clear, especially for buildings that were financially under a lot of constraint, also had lots of repair and maintenance requirements, was there was just a general compliance deferment. What I mean by that is what was very clear, that workplace health and safety audits were being delayed, or there was a vote that they didn't pass the vote. Valuations, building valuations for insurance purposes, capital works fund updates, of sinking fund forecasts, and those sorts of things. They sort of go by the by when a building's under financial constraint. So that is all contributing to all the pain in relation to building care inaction. And the last thing that was made my job harder when I went through these documentation was there's just a lack of historical scheme information. So it was really hard to see, well, 10 years ago, it seemed to be that the money was spent to deal with a particular leak, but who did the work? Was there some warranties in relation to the work that was undertaken? What was the issue? Very difficult to clearly identify what had gone on previously in those buildings, right from like throughout the life cycle of a building. And so we just need to get better at trying to harvest that information and have some sort of repository of information around what has actually happened in terms of any remedial works within that building. I think it becomes very, very difficult for contractors that come onto site, not knowing what has been done previously in the building, what type of products, for example, had been used. That information is just lacking, and I think it's causing more cost and time delays while people try and figure out what has gone on within that building or within that scheme previously. So these are certainly all factors that have really contributed to building care inaction. This is what I see consistently. I'm sure that the people in the audience, especially those in management, are going, yes, this is what we see quite regularly as well. So it's nothing really new for people in the know, but I think it's important that we provide information around this so we can have a deeper discussion around how these things actually work.
And Nicole, I'll just jump in quickly and say that there's a lot of support for what you're saying in the chat at the moment. I know that you're in the middle of the session and it's hard to see all the comments that are coming through, but just to let you know that a lot of people, your message is resonating with a lot of our audience today.
Oh, no, that's fantastic, Nikki. I'm really glad, because it is really, it is, I think, probably the number one critical risk, because it is about people's lives. They're living in these buildings, and we need to make sure that they are safe. So that's really important to hear. So what are some of the recommendations that I came up with off the back of that research to improve building care inaction? And I've just sort of highlighted a few areas. The list was quite extensive. But I think number one is around education. And I think this is education for a lot of people. Managers in particular, strata managers and building managers. They're obviously, they do a lot in relation to governance, especially strata managers, but we need to have a better understanding of how the building actually works. And there's real complexities around this. And I'm saying that not because I think that strata managers should be the ones actually doing the work or providing advice about the type of work that needs to be done. That's for other professionals to be involved in. But I think they're the conduit, they're that trusted advisor between the owners corporation, the committee, and these contractors. And there's a lot of questions that go back and forth between the parties. And I think it really will be helpful if managers have a better understanding about what is actually happening in these buildings and what needs to perhaps happen. They can be that sort of, that informed conduit for their strata schemes. And also navigating, remedial works, as I said. But as I said, you've got to be a little bit careful of service creep. It's not their job to give you advice about what needs to happen. There's other people out there, but just general knowledge is really, really important that they provide that service to their clients. The next thing is recognition, and I think this is the hardest part and this is why we have so much problems with building care inaction, is that owners don't really recognise that they're custodians of the buildings for their lifetime, because we have transitional arrangements. A lot of people will come into buildings for a couple of years, then want to sell and move on and that sort of thing. So they're dealing with whatever's happening at that particular time. And I know that if it's on the cards that there's, major works that need to be done and they may not want to, they don't want to pay for that. They're getting out and then some other poor person is coming in, and then they will have to deal with the costs associated with dealing with some of these complex repairs. And it becomes really problematic when things are being left, because the costs are so much higher. And so it's really unfair for an incoming owner to have to pay for, the previous committee or the previous owners that didn't pay attention and didn't take care of those buildings. So we need to change the mindset and be very, very clear that all owners, no matter how long you're in that building for, are custodians of the building for its lifetime. We all have to step up and every year pay attention and take care of the building, because fundamentally there's a legal obligation here. In every single state and territory in this country, there is a obligation on the owners corporation to, at the very least, maintain the common property. The terminology and the phrasing used in each jurisdiction is very different. We have repairs and maintenance, we have just maintenance in some jurisdictions. The level of detail in the legislation it does vary, but all of them have the legal obligation. You can't get around this. It's a strict obligation. There's no, well, I'll only do that when we've got the money to do it. We'll only deal with repairs and maintenance when we can afford it, or, when we're up to it, or, if something else happens. That's not how the law works, but there is a high level of non-compliance very, very clearly, and that's contributing to the problems that we're seeing. So we really need to be very, very clear. Managers in particular need to be very, very clear. And I think they do a very good job, I must say, looking through the minutes, of being very clear to their clients that there is this legal obligation. They must comply with the legislation. But of course, we see that, for a multitude of reasons why people don't comply with the law. But we need to keep on the front foot focusing on this. We need to bring it up in every single committee meeting, every single meeting, that this is a really important thing. The next area in terms of recommendation is around engagement. So again, as I sort of noted on the previous slide, engaging qualified project managers is really important. And I've spoken to a number of project managers across the country. There's different requirements in different states. In a state like Queensland, there's licensing requirements. Project managers must be licensed in Queensland to do this sort of work. In a state like Western Australia, they're unfortunately behind the 8 ball on this, and they don't have those sorts of licensing requirements. So, but what you need to be looking at is, what's their education, what's their background? You need to be talking to other people about the works that they've undertaken. You just need to be much more careful, and your strata manager and your building manager should be able to help you navigate. That should be one of their roles, to assist owners, corporations and bodies corporate navigate what can be a very complex area. One thing that came through from the interviews that I did with project managers was they said, it would be really good if owners corporations could engage us early on. So not just when something becomes very, very critical and there needs to be a scope of works done and we need to start engaging with contractors to fix or remediate. start early on and bring us in regularly throughout the life of these buildings. You know, from year 2, year 4, year 6, there may not be a lot of things that need to be done, but at least they can keep an eye on things and they can have a conversation with you. You know, at this stage, you might need to get someone up on the roof to have a look at what's going on in the roof. It may not cost you very much at all, but it really will alleviate the pressure at the end when, if these works aren't looked at throughout the life cycle of these buildings. So I would say to strata managers and building managers that are listening, have a conversation with your committees about getting a project manager in regularly. They might just come to a meeting. It might only cost a couple of $100. You build up a relationship with someone and they can sort of talk to you about prioritising different works, prioritising things to look at. It's a separate thing from relying solely on the whoever you engage to come in and do the sinking fund forecast or the capital works fund forecast. They may be looking at different sorts of infrastructure in the building where you might want to get a project manager or you might want to get an engineer in to look more holistically at the building. So let's not just rely simply on, we've got our sinking fund forecast, we'll fund that, and then we'll just wait until things sort of go wrong. Think about engaging project managers early throughout the life cycle. They can plan things out, they can do feasibility so that you are more prepared for these works as the building ages. And of course, as I said, engaging in other professionals. If you've got really complex remedial works that need to be done and you've got contracts that need to be signed, you really should be thinking about engaging a lawyer. I know it's an extra cost, but they can make sure that your rights are protected. I've seen things go terribly wrong when contractors are engaged. They don't do the work. They do a bit of it and leave with your money. There's a whole range of things that can go wrong. So I think if you're investing in a lot of complex work, you should really be talking to a qualified lawyer. Same with a financial advisor. What's the best way to fund the works that need to be done? Get some advice around that. And also, as I said, let's get some advice around where the boundaries are. Every single scheme should have a plan that's accessible to everyone that highlights clearly the boundaries. These are your boundaries, these are your responsibilities, this is the common property. So that it becomes very, very clear throughout the ownership for everyone what their responsibilities are. So I think that's really critical for every scheme to have that. I know in the schemes that I'm involved in, I sit on a number of committees, we've got very clearly articulated surveys with everything highlighted. Mine's a very complex scheme, so we've got lots of different boundaries involved, but it's very clear to us, who's responsible for what. So I think that helps dealing with what conflict might arise when an owner perhaps mightn't have the knowledge around boundaries. And the last area is definitely, as I said, around proactivity. This is really important. We need to have regular meetings around capital works reviews. So I think that every committee meeting, this should be discussed. How are we going? Let's get out our forecast. How are we going in terms of what should be coming up in the next year, the next 2 years, in terms of how our infrastructure is coping? Do we need to get a specialist engineer in to look at something? What is actually going on? It should be the most important topic to be discussed, I think, at every single meeting. We need to plan these things out better. What I see and what came out of the research was sinking fund forecast or capital works fund forecasts, maintenance plans, whatever they are in your jurisdictions, are very much used as budgetary tools. We get them in, we look at how much money needs to be set aside per year in the budget, and then we move on. Very rarely are people, bringing them into the meeting, showing, okay, where we are this year, what do we need to be looking at for the next year, what infrastructure needs to be dealt with in the coming years based on those forecasts. They should be amended regularly. We shouldn't just be getting one every 7, 8, 9 years and then not doing anything about it. Every time that there's an issue that needs to be dealt with, or you have works that are undertaken, that sinking fund forecast should be amended. Okay, so we should be looking at as more of a living instrument on a yearly basis. I think it's really important. I think we shouldn't discount holistic building inspections as well. As I said, getting an engineer in or a qualified person to look at the actual structural elements of your building to see how they're going over the life of the life cycle of the building. We're seeing in other jurisdictions where governments are now intervening in this process. So a number of states in America, Hong Kong, Singapore, where the government now requires, so it's mandated, holistic building inspections at certain times throughout the life cycle of a building. So at the 10-year mark, the 20-year mark, that is requiring an engineer to come in, look at your building, and then you are forced to repair and maintain anything that is outstanding. The problem is that leads to higher costs because you've got a lot of more government intervention than it would. So I think here in Australia, we're in a really good position to start now thinking differently about these buildings and getting people in to look holistically at our building. What's the structure like? How are we going with it? Getting more knowledge so that we can deal with aging building stock so much better. As I said, historical registers, we need someone to create an easy way to hold this information in a register so that any contractor that is dealing with your building can come in, look at it, know what has happened in relation to different elements or systems within the building, who did the work, what products were used, whether there were warranties or still warranties available. We need something like that, a system that helps with that. Yes, I know it's a greater impost on managers, but it's a service that you should be providing, I think. And the last thing on this topic is around improvement strategies. Another thing that came out of the research was we saw some schemes that when they had quite a bit of money, they were the fund hoggers, had quite a bit of money in their sinking fund. And then they thought, oh, okay, well, I think it's time to refurbish the foyer, refurbish the pool area, do these sorts of improvements that aren't really about repair and maintenance. They're a separate type of thing. And then all the money gets expended on those sorts of things. And then really you're down on your sinking fund forecast to deal with the more important works that impact people's safety and well-being. So we have to have a strategy. If you want to do up the pool area, if you want to do up the foyer, that might be a separate conversation in terms of how that gets funded and what needs to be done there. Don't use those sinking fund monies unless it's been applied in that way for those sorts of things. Keep those funds to what they were required to be used for in the forecast that's been prepared for you. So going on to our next risk area, conflicts of interest. And I know there might be some eye rolling because it's a conversation that's been going on for a while. And I'm going to be really clear, it's not going to go away. I think we all have to deal with this. And yes, our strata managers have been kicked pretty hard in relation to this, but it also applies to anyone that really owes duties that are what we call loyalty based or best interest types of duties. So yes, strata managers, building managers, developers, committees, they all have these sorts of duties. So conflicts of interest is something that they really need to think carefully about. The risks can manifest in a whole different way, a whole number of ways. Financial risk for owners, corporations, bodies corporate, reputational risk for managers, professional status risks for managers, so they're not being seen in the light that perhaps they should be. Trust erosion is very paramount and it can cause harm. So we've got to be very mindful of these risks. And what we're seeing is it's now often going to be leading to regulatory change. In New South Wales has certainly started off, but we can see in states like Victoria, they're going to start their review soon and they'll be looking into these areas as well. Now, when we talk about conflicts of interest, normally I go into quite a bit of detail talking about how we define a conflict of interest. Most people sort of have a bit of a sense when they see a conflict of interest that there's a conflict of interest, but I have seen lots of people promote definitions that are just so wordy and problematic you wouldn't really understand what's going on. I try and offer a very sort of straightforward type of definition and happy to talk another time about it. But basically conflicts of interest fall into two categories. We have the legal problems and we have the moral problems. And so what the law has tried to do is intervene in this space to tell us what is problematic behaviour, where these risks are in terms of conflicts of interest. And they also sometimes give us a defence around disclosure. So we've got legislation in every state, strata-related legislation that deals with some of these conflicts of interest. We also have the Criminal Code or the Crimes Act, depending on your state, that also deals with secret commissions that you need to be aware of. And then, of course, we've got the general law of fiduciary. It comes out of equity. It can be a little bit more complicated for people to understand, but I'm not going into any detail about that today because it's quite time-consuming to wrap your head around it. But I think we need to be looking at the legal part of this, these legal problems, and the way that the legislation is dealing with it and the law is dealing with it very much as the minimum standards. It's compliance. You are ticking a box. So when people say to me, oh, Nicole, but we put in our AGM and we put in our contract of appointment that we get X percentage in relation to the insurance commission, or we get a referral fee of this. And, so we're being really transparent. We're being really honest. We're doing the right thing. Yes, you're complying with the law. That is all you're doing. You are complying with the law. It doesn't take away from the fact that there is still a conflict of interest and you should be dealing with it. Okay, so there's no out just through compliance. What I'm more focused on is around these moral problems. So, we look to sort of business ethics. We look at codes of conduct that sort of try to regulate some of these behaviours in a different way, and social norms. So for the next couple of slides, I'm going to sort of deal more in relation to this as a moral problem, which I think is where our mind needs to turn to. So in terms of sort of the threshold of what constitutes a conflict of interest, the bar is very low. It's very, very low. You are often in a conflict of interest situation, sometimes unwillingly, but they are very much inherent in the strata industry. Okay. And it's not dissimilar to any other industry where we have loyalty-based duties as a feature. There are a lot of businesses that don't have these sorts of duties. They can do, whatever they really want within the bounds of whatever laws that apply to them. But we are different in strata because we've got lots and lots of different groups of people that have these, that are required to are required to act in a way that's in the best interests of their clients. So conflicts of interest really arise whenever there is just a temptation to elevate your interests. That's why I'm saying the threshold is really low. Whenever there's just a temptation to elevate your interest, you are in a conflict of interest. Okay. Now it's really clear that a conflict of interest in itself is not wrong. Okay. Sometimes you might be in a conflict of interest against your will. And a good example would be is if I'm a strata manager and a supplier or a service provider comes into my office and says to me, oh, listen, Nicole, if you can, refer my services to your owners corporation clients, I will give you a 10% referral fee. I mean, you haven't done anything, but you are in a conflict of interest. Okay, you're in it. Whether you like it or not, you're in it. So it's not about the fact that you're in a conflict of interest. As I said, it is inherent in a lot of parts of the strata industry. It's what you do next. So when you are confronted with a conflict of interest, it's what you do next is the most important thing here. Now, this is, I think, a really good overview of how we can manage conflicts of interest, and it's the 5 E's. I didn't come up with it. Another academic scholar did. But I think it's helpful for people to deal with this that are caught in these conflicted relationships and practices. The first thing that I think people need to do is they really need to explore what are the laws, code of conducts that have been established that deal with conflicts of interest. And of course, managers in particular, strata managers, are pretty good at understanding what it is in terms of the strata legislation and what their requirements are under that. They're not so good often with the common law, and they're certainly not good with any criminal code provisions. But there is a good sense that they understand the laws, and of course, the industry body has a code of conduct. Hopefully, a number of management companies also have their own internal code of conduct that deals with conflicts of interest. So we need to understand that. This is the exploration part of it. You need to be mindful of what are the relationships and practices that give rise to a conflict of interest. Some of those have been dealt with in legislation, some of them have not. Okay, and this is where the danger comes in terms of fiduciary duties. The next thing you really need to do is you need to evade. Evading these conflict of interest situations is really important. it's really a must. But as I just gave with the example with someone coming in, a service provider coming into an office, sometimes it is difficult to achieve. What I have seen is some really good management companies, and there's certainly a movement towards sort of really moving away and not getting involved in conflicted interests, is they'll be really clear maybe on their website, the way that they speak to people, that they do not want to have anything to do with any of this. They aren't taking insurance commissions. They don't take kickbacks or referral fees. They don't, might not do developer work where there's some sort of relationship situation happening. They might not have affiliated and associated entities involved, and they make that really clear. It's quite a promotion for their firm to say, we denounce this, we are evading it. Go knock on someone else's door. The next thing, if you can't evade it, is to escape it. So it's cutting ties or declining it. So when the offer comes, you're very clear, no, that is not our jam. We don't deal with these sorts of situations. We will not take referral fees. We will not take gifts or whatever it is. Or cut ties with the entities that are trying to tempt you. Okay, that's where the focus needs to be. We need to be evading and escaping. The next thing is exposure. And this is where things become a little bit more tricky, because exposure is really around disclosure. So one of the points is to manage a conflict is if we communicate the conflict of interest in such a way that the other party does not fail to recognize the seriousness of the situation. So there are a lot of people say, if we expose this, if we're disclosing it, then, people are rational people. They can work out what the harmful effects of this might be, and, they can do something about that. That does not actually work. Disclosure is a flawed mechanism. It does not work for a number of reasons. There's a lot of psychological theories and literature and studies that have been done that clearly show that disclosure is a problematic mechanism to deal with conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, governments seem to think that they're okay. But in any event, even if you disclose the conflict of interest still remains. So any of those risk factors, the harmful effects that conflicts of interest can have, is still there, right? It's still there. You've just exposed it. The last thing, and this is becomes this sort of circular argument, is to execute. And there's really no way around this. The duty must still be executed ethically. So you've exposed it. It's still there. You still have a duty to act in the best interests of your clients. I'm not sure how you can do that often in these sorts of situations. So I hope that gives some context about why these are so problematic and what people need to do about it. So the main points are that if you comply with the legal requirements relating to conflicts of interest, you still have an ethical problem to address. And I know this is the hard barrier for people to get over, because we do everything the law tells us to do, Nicole, but you still have an ethical problem that you need to address here. You're still in a conflict of interest. If you disclose all material information and facts relating to conflicts of interest, you still have an ethical problem to address. So what do I think managers can do? I think you have to address these ethical risks. I think you can't ignore them anymore. And it's really great to see that so many management companies are addressing these. They're thinking more about them. You may need to change your practice and remuneration model. I know that's very difficult, but I think there's more conversation about this. And I think you really have to promote and market ethical behaviour. You differentiate yourself in the marketplace, and I've seen this, as I said, I've observed this, and I think it's a really good thing to do. What can owners, corporations or bodies corporate do? Well, I think seek out and change to managers that are behaving more ethically, that are promoting their business in this way. Same as suppliers, service providers that promote ethical practices. One example I can give you is the Australian College of Strata Lawyers. They've instituted a pledge for the lawyers that are members of that college. And it's about this. It's denouncing these sorts of, conflicts of interest. And another thing and this is I suppose, a bit of a practical thing that I did in our schemes, is to pass a motion to ensure that affiliated and associated entities are not used in supplying services. So every year we passed a motion to say, manager, don't even come come to us with, a quote or a referral to some organisation or company that's affiliated with you. So I think that's a bit of a practical thing. The last risk, and this is where we sort of divert a little bit, is around poorly considered regulatory reforms. And so what I've seen over, a number of decades is there's been a real movement away from self-governance. So bodies corporate, owners corporations were really created as self-governing types of entities. And I think if memory serves me correct, in the Queensland legislation, it sort of says about self-management. It probably should say self-governance, but self-management, that's how they've been created to govern themselves. But there's clearly a shift away from that. There's limited autonomy in terms of what individual owners, corporations, and bodies can do in terms of the way that they govern. And I think personally, I think that's unfortunate, but I understand where the need has actually come from. In terms of regulation in this area, again, I think it's been quite reactionary. There seems to be this attempt to, as I've got there, plug every hole or every problem. So a situation arises, government will hear from, a number of people about certain concerns, and then it's like, okay, well, we need to regulate that. We need to block that hole off. And so what we're getting is just more and more regulation. And I have to question, I've just put a question mark here, is, are we over regulating this area? And, we seem to be getting more and more legislation, more and more laws, and of course it becomes quite difficult for volunteer committee members and also owners that may not be across all these different legal requirements to manage this effectively. So there's some concern around this. One thing that really annoys me is the lack of evaluation of our laws, both of the laws within our states and laws that are across jurisdictions. We're sort of fortunate in Australia that we've got 8 jurisdictions, 8 states and territories that have their own strata legislation. And we're seeing sort of a bit of a departure in terms of what those regulations look like. We've got the sort of central tenets, I suppose, but we do see some real variation in terms of the way that different states approach some of these areas. But what we don't do is we don't go and then evaluate to see what's working well. So we don't go to other states and do any sort of research and evaluation to see, is that change that's been made working really well, and maybe we should import it into our jurisdiction or our state. We do that poorly. We don't evaluate our own laws well enough. It just seems to be, that doesn't work, let's do this. Okay, and we seem to keep doing that. Governments do go through consultation processes, and we've seen that more and more. The problem, and I think consultation is great, don't get me wrong, I think it's really important, but it can be really dominated by self-interested parties. And then that can lead to some poor outcomes in terms of reform. So we have to think of, I think, law reform, looking at a number of different methodologies in relation to how we approach it. And I think sometimes there's unintended consequences in terms of reforms. So things sometimes look good, yet we should do that. Then we see down the track actually how it rolls out in reality. And I think just one thing that comes to mind at the moment is payment plans in terms of levies. And so some governments are starting to legislate in relation to this, but I'm not quite sure that we've really thought through what happens in the schemes if a lot of people on payment plans and how things actually get paid for. So I think there are sometimes unintended consequences that we haven't really thought about when we're going through the reform process. And I think, when we're seeing more and more regulations, obviously we're seeing more costs. So management companies are having to do more things because they're acquiring to get their schemes to comply with this regulation, which is an extra cost that has to be passed on to owners, corporations, and bodies corporate. Okay, so I think we just have to think a bit differently in relation to how we approach law reform. I think prioritisation is a key, and it really does baffle me that procedural-based regulations are becoming more prescriptive than regulations aimed at resident safety and well-being. And one example that I can give is in relation to something like proxies and repairs. And if I look at, for example, the Queensland legislation and the amount of room that is dedicated to proxies, dealing with all different scenarios in relation to proxies, it's actually absurd. And then we've got this sort of very short paragraph that talks about the obligation to maintain the common property. it's bizarre when we're talking about, safety of people, and then these procedural things where it's just being, there's an enormous amount of room being taken up in the legislation on these sorts of things. So I think our priorities have been a bit skewed, I think. So we need to change, I think, or consider the reform narrative. We need to prioritise harm-based regulations over these other procedural things. We need to think maybe whether it's about governance guidance as opposed to being quite prescriptive with the laws. Go back to the intention of what these entities were created to do. But I think that's part of a bigger conversation. I'm just highlighting that as something that maybe we should consider. And I think we need to consider structure regulations to encourage compliance. As I said, compliance is a real problem in strata. And we've seen this, as I highlighted in relation to repairs and maintenance, compliance goes out the door if there's not enough money or people don't want to raise levies to deal with their repair and maintenance obligations. So we do need to do something about that. The concern is, and this is where I think we may end up, is that the government will intervene and will lead to increased costs, as I've said, and we'll look to things like in Florida, where they've got what's called a milestone inspection regime, which is mandated. And so people won't have the options of starting to prioritise their own works. It'll just be, this is failing, you've got 6 months or a year to fix it. They'll come back and they'll look at you, and there'll be enormous penalties that will apply if you don't comply with these sorts of requirements. So this is happening in the world, and we need to be mindful of it. So what can we do? Well, as we ask owners corporations to be more proactive in managing building repairs and maintenance, we should be asking our government to be more proactive in addressing law reform. Given we have, 8 states and territories regulating strata, we can learn lots of lessons from others. I think we need to encourage governments to invest in independent research and evaluation. Yes, I'm biased. I'll put that right out there. But change in this area is afoot. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, because New South Wales government is starting to engage researchers to do work in this area, not only directly related to strata, but also we've seen it in relation to the building commissioner. And I think everyone can be more involved in harvesting and providing data and participating in research. And that probably is a bit of an action to management companies, both building and strata management companies. You've got so much data that really could provide some great insights into what works well and what doesn't work well. And I think we can all come together and assist in the long run. So I'm doing some current research, as I said, with New South Wales government, and this is a bit of a call to action, but it is only for New South Wales only at the moment. And I have 2 projects that I'm hoping some people out there might be interested in helping or participate in. The first project this has been funded by the New South Wales Fair Trading. So they've come to me to undertake this research, and it's evaluating strata management agreements in practice and practices in New South Wales. They are looking for us to draft an agreement that may be a model agreement, or they may mandate it. I don't know which way that they will go on that. That's going to be up for them to go through their processes. But that's what we're in the process of doing at the moment. So I've got 2 invitations. One is for strata lot owners, this is in New South Wales, to participate in some focus groups. So this is in July the 21st. I've got a venue in Haymarket, and the Haymarket one's at the Office of Fair Trading, Moore Park. I think it's at the golf course there, or golf club there, and at Chatswood on the 22nd. And then I'll have an online focus group for people that are sort of outside of Sydney or unable to get to those. We might put a few more on if people are really interested in this, but I really want to understand from an owner's perspective how they read, understand, decipher the agreements that come their way, if they know, and also some of the practices that are sort of highlighted, or services that provide highlighted in these agreements. I also want to hear from more senior strata managers and principals. I've got some interviews going on. I'd like to hear for some more. This is running till the end of July, so please just email me. The email address is at the bottom if you'd like to participate. I'll give you more information. We have ethics consents and those sorts of things. The other project is around these conflicts of interest and conflicted relationships. And this again is New South Wales centric. So it's an invitation to Strata lot owners to participate in what's going to be an online scenario-based research activity. It's going to be straightforward and simple, I promise. It's not going to be overly complicated. They'll be online on the 29th and the 30th of July. So again, if you're interested, I'd really love to hear from people, and please email me and I'll give you further information to participate in that. And very last, Nikki, I promise I'm at the end here. As Nikki highlighted, I run a conference called the Strata Impact Conference. We're coming up to our second year, which is on the 14th and 15th of August. It's held at the Langham Hotel on the Gold Coast, and we still got some early bird tickets available to the 11th of July. You can go onto the site and have a look what the program is. It's quite a diverse program, but it's really, there's going to be a number of different researchers there, really informed people to talk more in detail about some of these, not only the discussion points that I've sort of raised today, but other things as well. And so this is open to anyone in the strata sector, anyone that's interested in having these conversations and being part of the bigger conversation, whether you're a manager, whether you're in development, whether you're in real estate, any service provider that touches on strata, and of course owners, if you're interested in having, being part of these deeper conversations. Of course, you're also welcome. There are fees, I must say, but we'd love to be able to build on this and have more diverse voices being part of this conversation at this conference. So I'd love some, for more people to come along to that if possible. That's it from me, Nikki. There's my contact information. People are welcome to email me. You can have a look at Strata Knowledge website and see what sort of work, and I've got a lot of research briefs and reports that are up there that you can download. And of course, if you're on LinkedIn, you can follow me. But that's it, Nikki. Thanks so much.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole. Someone asked for some clarification around the agreements one, and whether that is to develop a different agreement, an alternative agreement to the SCA agreement.
That's correct. That's correct. So my team, so I've got Professor Peter Butt and Professor Kathy Sherry, and I will be drafting a new agreement. That is, yes, it is different to any other, it will be different to any other agreement that's in the market, and then it'll go to the government for their consideration and consultation.
Fantastic. So that's just for New South Wales, though, at this stage?
Just for New South Wales. Just for
okay, which is a shame, but
yes, well, you never know. Everyone needs to go and talk to their, members of parliament, I suppose, and see if, some more work can be done in other jurisdictions. Happy to do that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great idea. So yeah, contact your local member and have a chat with them. Mention that things are happening in New South Wales. Why can't they be happening in other states as well? And try and get some action there on the ground from your member, especially if you're in an area where you've got predominantly strata buildings, and that's a big part of the voters in that area. You can really lobby for that and put a lot of pressure on them and try and get some action in your local area, which would be fantastic. I asked, are we over-regulating? Because you had mentioned it in one of your final slides. Or is more regulation needed? And I think a few people in the chat had put up comments to say, I think more enforcement of the current rules is required, not more rules. More enforcement of the rules definitely needs to occur. So that would seem to be a common theme around whether regulation or whether we're over-regulated.
Yep. And I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. I mean, that's, it's a really important part of this conversation around enforcement, definitely. So yeah, no, I think we need to keep having this conversation and talking to government about how to deal with this more effectively.
If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.